welcome back, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alissa Cooper, who is the Executive Director of the Knight-Georgetown Institute. I've known her for 15 years, I want to say, and throughout that time, I think she has been a role model for the many different ways in which you can do impactful work by combining technical expertise and policy expertise. So most recently, she's been at the Knight-Georgetown Institute, and what I've learned is that the Institute is a fantastic place to do the kind of translational work in tech policy that is hard to really focus on at a place like CITP, which is more academically oriented. And you're going to hear about the kinds of work that KGI does. And I think they're a great unit for some of us to partner with. I've had a little bit of an opportunity to do that, and I've come to realize how big a gap there is in the kinds of work that you've been doing. And before that, she was at Cisco for a decade. She held a variety of leadership roles: VP of Tech Standards, VP of Tech Policy, VP and CTO of Tech Policy. And she was also the chair of the Internet Engineering Task Force during that time for many years. So influencing policy through technical standards is something that many folks who are new to this field might not have a lot of experience with, but that is something that can be very powerful, and maybe you'll get a chance to talk to her about some of that if you've signed up for a one-on-one meeting with her. And before that, she was the am I saying this right? The chief computer scientist for the CDT.
The title we made up.
Where she was a crucial source of technical expertise for the public interest work that the organization did. And in terms of substantive topics, it has ranged up and down the stack, from things like network performance, privacy and security, encryption, net neutrality, and more recently things like social media and AI. And finally, I'll mention that she's also on our advisory council, and we're very grateful for that. So I'll turn it over to her after very briefly mentioning that if you have a thing to get to after this and you're looking at that clock, you're probably going to miss your next thing. That's way off, so make sure you have another accurate source of time. All right, over to you, Alissa. Welcome again.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's great to be here. I feel like I've been working with CITP for many years in practice, and also sort of in spirit, just very aligned with the work that everybody does here. So it's great to finally be able to visit and to talk to all of you today about a particular piece of work at the Knight-Georgetown Institute. This line of work is called Better Feeds, algorithms that put people first, and really was essentially our first project as an institute. So KGI began last year. I'm the executive director. I started in February of 2024 to create this new institute, which, as Arvind said, really sits on the bridge between research and policy, trying to take research and evidence from out in the field and make it into something which is actionable and legible for policymakers of different kinds. And I will talk about that quite a bit more today through the lens of this particular piece of work, looking at online algorithmic feeds, what is wrong with them today, and how we can make them better through policy and product design.
It's not going to be a problem, Diane.
I don't have the mute privileges, but
some things never change.
Folks can mute. Yeah, amazing start. Here's the QR code and the link to this work. This landing page will get you a version of the Better Feeds report, which is the long version. If you're a short version type of person, there's also a US-focused two-pager, an EU-focused two-pager, some other supporting materials, a much longer version of this slide deck, and a variety of other things. So check it out if you want to take a deep dive into Better Feeds. Quick agenda for today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the policy landscape that led us to this work, do a little bit of background on recommender system design and the specific features that we felt it was important to focus on, and actually kind of articulate some terminology and do some definitional work around. Walk through briefly the Better Feeds policy guidance that our group articulated, give you a sense of how this work has been received by policymakers in a variety of jurisdictions, and then a little preview about what's next, and also some sort of solicitation of other ideas of things that we could do in this line of work, and hoping to leave a bunch of time for Q&A. Feel free to stop me as I go through, however, if you have questions or anything along the way. We don't have to save it for the end.
You need earbuds.
I love our friend who's participating remotely. So just a few words about the Knight-Georgetown Institute. I mean, Arvind described it to some extent already. Our tagline is an information future for the common good. That's what we are working towards. We are a center based at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., whose mission is dedicated to connecting independent research with technology policy and design, specifically with a focus on the online information environment. So we tend to think about social media, search, messaging, AI in various forms. And we have, broadly speaking, two areas of focus. One is more on the platform governance side, thinking about platform regulation, accountability, transparency. That's where the work that I'm going to talk about today sits. We have another side of the house which focuses more on competition in tech, where we've done a lot of transatlantic learning between the US and the EU, as well as a deep dive into search competition, which I've talked to a bunch of folks here about in the last couple of months. And we work in a bunch of different ways. So although we are based in DC, we are not laser focused on the federal government as a change agent these days. When we think about where the opportunities are for proactive change in policy, we've looked a little bit more towards state legislators, to litigation, including public and private litigation, and working with the EU and to some extent in the UK as well. So we take a sort of broad brush, lots of focus on how we can make policy more effective and what research and evidence we can bring to bear in that pursuit. The work that I'm talking about today is the product of an expert working group that we formed on recommender systems. I recognize some people on this slide who are also in the room. And really what we wanted to do with this was to bring together some of the deepest experts in the space who truly understand recommender system design, have done some of the formative work around this, cross-cutting between academia, civil society, and even industry. So we had a couple of folks from industry who participated in this group as well, and really wanted to try to bring something out that could represent the consensus of this group of experts, so that it's not just KGI doing translation, but it's a broader group who can vouch for and contribute to the work. I will also just note, a lot of this was inspired in the origin by the work that Arvind did during his stint with the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia, which is a different institute, which calls itself the Knight Institute, which is why we lean hard into KGI, but we work with them a ton and we love them too. So just wanted to flag that this was very much an inspiration that led to the rest of this work. So I'm going to start with the policy landscape. Why algorithmic feed design and why now? If we look across, especially at the state level in the US, in the last couple of years, we've seen the introduction of legislation across 43 states since 2023, dealing in some way with algorithmic harms related to social media. In many of these cases, these bills have been focused on kids online and kids online safety, or sort of representing families, schools, and so on. But not always. So we also have in this category the kind of approaches where they're driven by concerns around sort of shadow banning, downranking, this kind of thing, or generally speaking, just concerns about algorithmic harm. So more than 175 bills across 43 different states in the last 2 years. This is a very bipartisan concern. And that shows us that there's sort of a groundswell of interest in this topic. There's also a lot of litigation activity going on in this space. So there's more than 500 lawsuits that have been filed against online platform companies, mostly on behalf, again, of children, families, school districts, alleging some sort of algorithmic harm. So there's definitely questions to be answered and addressed here. And one of the defining features that we saw when we looked at the policy discourse originally last year was that the question around algorithmic harm and what to do about it is often presented as a false choice, that we can either have the algorithms that power online platforms today, or we can have non-personalized or chronological feeds, or what the press likes to present as no algorithms at all, or like life after algorithms, which is like a little hard to grapple with, but I've gotten over it trying to convince people that there's still an algorithm there, like that's okay. But it's often presented as this binary choice, right? That it's like we have what we have today, or we sort of revert back to a very simple, basic approach, chronological or reverse chronological feed. And you see that I just picked out this Arkansas bill that shows this. That's both explicitly saying platforms have to allow minors to opt out of personalization, but also implying that the way to do this is to give them a chronological feed. And what we knew from looking even at a surface level at a bunch of the research in this space is that those are not the only two choices, and that actually there's a much broader space of designs and approaches that are available theoretically to platforms to think about how they optimize their algorithmic feeds. It's not attention maximization or chronological as the only two choices, and that is the space that we wanted to enter into and bring to life for policymakers so that they could be more thoughtful about how they were approaching what to do when they come to the table with concerns about algorithmic harm. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the definitional work that we did and how we got to the unifying theme for our policy guidance. Starting just with some definitions, I'm going to talk a lot about engagement. So when I talk about engagement, that encompasses the category of actions that users take on any items that are recommended to them. So this could include clicks, likes, comments, upvotes, downvotes, etc. When we think about recommenders, we think broadly. So a lot of the examples and a lot of the conceptualization in this talk and in the report sort of takes social media as the platforms that we're thinking of, but the same kind of principles can apply in gaming, in e-commerce, in search. As we know, recommenders are all over the place. Single platforms have many dozens of them that are powering different parts of the user experience. There might be one for ads, one for notification, one for main newsfeed, etc. So anytime an item is being recommended to a user and they are taking some action on it, we count that as engagement. I'll also just spend a moment on this word item because we're really trying to talk to policymakers in a way that helps them think about the design of systems as opposed to content. So I don't use the word content very much. This category of item encompasses things which, given who's thinking about it, may or may not be considered content. And that includes things like channels and groups and other accounts that might be recommended to you. It's not only thinking about posts that might be on a social media feed, but can include other kinds of elements that users encounter. And then the other important definition here is the definition of signal, which is really just a data input that's used for ranking items in a feed. And so platforms have lots of different kinds of signals that they collect and that they could use in their optimization of these feeds that describe the content or the user or the context or some combination of those things. And the variety of signals is an important feature in the development of the policy analysis here. I noted before that policymakers sort of come to the table with a variety of different algorithmic harms in mind, and then they're moving to institute these potential policy interventions. When we think about attention maximization and engagement-based algorithms, there's many harms that are downstream, potentially, of that design. So whether you come to this issue because you're really concerned about kids online and self-harm, whether your concern is polarization, toxicity, extremism, whether you're just sort of generally thinking about outrage and how that drives engagement on platforms, it actually doesn't matter too much which harm is the one that brings you to this conversation, because the design pattern in which engagement is the main way that the feeds are optimized is upstream of all of these and really drives the same pattern, regardless of whether the content or the items that users are engaging with is potentially harmful because it is hate speech or it's self-harm content or eating disorder content and so on. And that's, I think, useful in the policy conversation because we can be broad in terms of those with whom we engage. Whichever part of this circle they are sitting on, we can talk about the nature of engagement-based optimization and how it plays into the ultimate dynamic. And we don't have to be specific about which one of these is the one that's driving the work because it's really a design question as opposed to a content question. One of the important definitional pieces that we did here was to put forth a characterization of user signals. I was really surprised when we got into this work with the working group overall about the general lack of standardized terminology or definitional work that had been done in the space of recommender systems. So even some like basic things, like there's a whole section in this report of definitions, and I've heard from people say like this is the most useful part of the report. So building on those definitions, we also did this sort of taxonomy of user signals. And we separated these, what we came out with was really kind of 4 different spectra in which we can think about the signals that platforms are collecting from users on the platform. The first one is from impulsive to deliberative. So when we think about different kinds of signals sitting along this spectrum, some of the usage that users experience on these platforms, you can rightly characterize as impulsive. You can reshare a link without clicking on it. You can reshare a link without clicking on it first. You might like a video after you've only watched a short portion of it. Even writing like a quick comment can reflect impulsivity. And there's other kinds of engagement signals that reflect more deliberative engagement. So writing a longer comment, making a purchase, filling out a survey, and so on. So that's the first one. The second one is from effortless to onerous. So some kinds of engagement on these platforms require more effort from the user and some require less. Effortless sorts of things, again, clicks, reactions, reshares. It's so easy to tap that button and they make it easier all the time. Whereas there's more onerous engagement, again, things like filling out a survey or watching an entire movie. You have to put in more effort to do these things. The third one is from inferred preference to stated preference. So there's much of the way that these platforms are optimizing systems are based on inferences about what users like or what they want, what makes them happy. So we might be inferring from the amount of time that is spent in the app, something about the user, what they click on, what they reshare. This is in contrast to explicit statements from the user expressing an actual preference directly. Things like, I go into my user controls, I set them a certain way. I say to, show me more of this kind of content or show me less of this kind of content. Even some emoji reactions might be considered more explicit or more stated preference than inferred preference. So the insightful button on LinkedIn, for example, it tells you something about how the user's feeling about this content. And then the last one, and is sort of like the catch-all one, is from ambiguous to clear. And this really came through in our group, is that a lot of the signals that platforms have and that they collect are actually ambiguous. So has anyone ever hate-liked something on social media or hate-watched something? Yeah, all right, it was only like 3 hands, man. I do a lot of hate-watching. Or when we think about this category of ambiguous, what you start to realize is that actually the signal that the platform is getting doesn't necessarily tell you that much about the user's actual intent, even when you're dwelling on something like who leaves YouTube on in the background so you can listen to music, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you're sitting there intently watching the video. And so the platform can't necessarily draw a firm conclusion from it, but they use this data extensively anyway. And then on the other side, we have signals that are clear, that if the user goes in and sets their setting, they're telling you something that's clear. If they're responding to a survey, given that they understand the question, then you can interpret the answer in a way that reflects what the user is actually thinking and trying to convey. Obviously, these spectra have some interrelationship, right? They're not like all completely distinct from one another, and you see a lot of overlap. But we felt that it was important to try to distinguish these because as we had the conversation in the working group, it became clear that doing away with all engagement signals, first of all, it's not really necessarily a realistic option, but also we sort of lose the part that is expressing more value and is closer to what the user actually might want and thinking about how we center around the user if we just painted all of engagement with a broad brush. So we tried to like put a little bit more meat on the bones when we think about engagement. And that brought us, I think, quite naturally to what we call the potato chip problem, which when people read this paper, it was just like, oh, yes, a lot of people read this paper already, some people. So it's a great paper from Kleinberg et al. And we're sort of drawing this potato chip analogy from the paper. So imagine that you're at a house party and you're walking into this house party and for you in your life, overall, in the long term, you have a desire to eat healthy. Like you're trying to eat more salad, basically. Who's not trying to eat more salad these days, right? But you walk into this party and you're chatting with your friends and there's this bowl of potato chips out on the table and you start eating them. And it's like, man, these potato chips are good. So you keep eating them and eating them. I think you have this long-term desire to eat salad, but you're at a party and it's like, it's fun. I'm gonna keep eating these potato chips. And the host comes out and notices that the potato chip bowl has been emptied, all been eaten. And so they conclude, oh, people here must really like potato chips. I'm gonna go back in the kitchen, refill the bowl and bring it out. And so they refill the bowl, they bring it out, and now people continue to eat potato chips, including you. And that's because they are salty and delicious, right? It's hard to stop eating potato chips, even though you have a long-term desire to eat salad. It's exactly the same mechanism that's going on when platforms optimize for engagement. They get all of this engagement data. A lot of it is impulsive. A lot of it is based on short-term thinking. It is not deliberative. It is not reflective of your forward-looking preferences that you have in your life. But it's hard to look away from that clickbait. It is hard to look away from that outrageous content. It is easy to dwell on it. It is easy to hit that like button and that reshare button. And so you do. And the platforms have vastly more quantities of this kind of engagement data than they do of some of those more deliberative, forward-looking kinds of data. And so if they optimize for this vast quantity of data, they keep refilling the potato chip bowl, even though you personally have a long-term interest in eating more salad or maybe seeing content that's of higher quality, less outrageous or toxic. So this is kind of the mechanism that we are trying to address when we think about what is the suite of policy recommendations that would actually be effective in incentivizing or requiring platforms to move away from engagement-based optimization and towards something that puts the user's interest at the center. And the concept that our group landed on for how to characterize this is long-term user value, by which we mean outcomes aligned with the deliberate forward-looking preferences and aspirations of users. So starting to tune more for what users want in the long term and less based on impulsive clicks and likes and reshares, which don't really tell us about what users really want out of their experience on this platform. Now, this being a set of policy guidance, we didn't want to be too prescriptive about how platforms get there. Platforms are very different. They have lots of different affordances, even just within the social media sphere. They have access to different kinds of data. They have different capabilities in terms of surveying users and running tests and so on. So our guidance doesn't tell platforms how to get to optimization for long-term user value. It just creates incentives for them to do it. We do say that we sort of highlight a variety of different approaches that could be used to get there. One is asking users to directly and explicitly state their preferences. Another is relying on surveys or indications of quality that are selected by the user or predictions of these things, because we know that platforms are using the comparatively small amount of survey data that they have to predict how users respond to surveys. And even those predicted survey responses can be higher quality and more valuable in terms of thinking about long-term value than engagement data might be. Relying on signals that are more onerous or clear or deliberative. So going back to our sort of characterization and taxonomy of signals, thinking about those signals that are more on the deliberative end or for which platforms get a clearer signal and putting more emphasis on those is another way, or some combination of these different approaches. Again, this is not prescriptive about how they do it, but it's creating incentives to think more about the user's long-term interest and less about short-term impulsivity. So the guidelines that we put forth, the core set of guidelines, fall into 3 different buckets. One is around design transparency, one is around user choices and defaults, and the last one is around assessments of long-term impact. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll talk about them kind of at a high level. I'll give one example in each category, and I'm happy to take questions and answer more about them later. So the first set is around design transparency. And in this category, each category has 3 recommendations because we had to have 3 categories of 3, just human brains can grok it. So this category is all about requirements for what platforms should have to disclose about the way that their recommenders are designed and the way that their internal operations work. So 3 requirements in this category. The first is to have platforms disclose all of the raw sources of input into their recommender systems, as well as the meaningful weights that are used to tune those systems, broken down by quartile. So that's a special little facet of this that we had a lot of debate about how to make such a disclosure meaningful even for independent experts and how to balance that vis-a-vis potential concerns about having platforms reveal sort of the secret sauce or trade secret kind of information. And we landed on at least having meaningful weights from these systems disclosed by quartile, such that independent experts would be able to evaluate, first of all, to be able to see the full list of input data sources that are contributing to these algorithms, and then being able to see their relative priority according to quartile. So that's the first one. The second one is a requirement to have platforms disclose the metrics that they use to measure long-term value. And the thinking behind this is dead simple. If you have to disclose the metrics that you use, then you have to have said metrics. So it's a way to get platforms thinking about long-term user value by virtue of instituting a transparency requirement. And then the last one would require the disclosure of the metrics that the platform uses to evaluate the teams responsible for recommender systems. And folks who have had, in some experience or exposure to the tech industry are probably aware of this, that platforms have gazillions of metrics, to use a very scientific term. If the requirement was to disclose them all, we would be awash in them. We wouldn't be able to make sense, heads or tails, of which ones matter. But certain ones of them are chosen as the means by which the teams within the companies are evaluated for performance, for bonus, for what have you. And often in the tech world, the mechanism for doing this is effectuated through objectives and key results, OKRs, which is just like the performance monitoring and review system that a lot of tech companies used. I know we used OKRs at Cisco, and it was a barrel of laughs. But the OKR system tells you, by virtue of having to choose the key results each quarter by which your team is going to be evaluated, there's only a couple of those usually. And so that tells you what the company is truly prioritizing when it's telling its teams, here, we want you to go out and increase engagement by X% this quarter, or we want click-throughs on this kind of ad to increase by however much this quarter. So it gives you a window into what the companies are prioritizing. And that would be a meaningful aspect of transparency if the point of this is to try to move away from engagement as the only metric that anybody thinks about when they're designing these systems. So that's the transparency piece. The second piece is around user choices and defaults, and I will just give give this disclaimer every time I give this talk. We are aware that most users don't touch their settings in any app, in any service that they use. The use of these kinds of things is low, and therefore, when you're recommending that users be given more choice or control, you are naturally likely only benefiting a pretty small section of the user population. Nevertheless, it's potentially a way to start moving in the direction of bringing alternative designs into existence. And for those who do make use of it, they could potentially benefit. So the first recommendation here is for platforms to provide an easily accessible choice of recommender systems, at least one of which is optimized for long-term user value. So the idea here is when you are interfacing with these systems that you begin to see a choice where it's a meaningful choice. It's not a choice between two engagement-oriented systems. It's a choice between whatever the default feed is and this potential other option. I will say that there is this notion that's already embedded, a sort of cousin of this notion already embedded in some existing policy and regulation. So the Digital Services Act in the European Union requires platforms to provide a choice and an alternative, but it provides that alternative. It requires that the alternative be essentially non-personalized, and most of the platforms that have implemented this have done so by instituting a chronological feed. So the kind of choice, I think, the sort of worked example that's out there in the world of this right now, that tens of millions of users are interacting with, is on Blue Sky. Where you can have a wide variety of choices of algorithmic feed, where you have third parties who are potentially providing different kinds of feeds, and where that choice is easily accessible from the home screen at any time. Just curious, like for those who are Blue Sky users, do you switch between different feeds? No. Yes. Okay. We got a couple nods. We got a few. Yes. So that's like tracks with the research, right? Most people don't use them, but it's nice that they're there for those who do. The second recommendation here is to have platforms honor users' preferences concerning recommended or blocked items. And this really comes from the insight that some platforms are already offering this kind of control, where you can, as I said before, show me more of this, show me less of this, right? I want you to hide certain kinds of content. Broadly speaking, understanding is that the perception of users is that these controls don't work. And so when I say hide this content, it isn't actually hidden. And so this recommendation says, actually hide it. That's literally all this says, is like trying to make those, the controls that are being offered to users enforceable, whether it's for, showing things or not showing things. And then the last bit here is the only recommendation we have that focuses specifically on minors. Where we recommend, instead of the choice, which is for the broad population, that minors recommender systems be optimized to support long-term value by default. So instead of it being an option, we say to make it the default for minors, and that's as a result of their essentially their state of cognitive development, that if we're thinking about their experience on these platforms and thinking about impulsivity in particular, which is obviously a strong theme here, that's a bigger struggle for minors in terms of their stage of brain development. And so actually making the long-term value feed the default is the more optimal choice for that population. And then the last set of recommendations relates to assessments of long-term impact. So what we know about platforms, again, is that many of them are running potentially thousands of experiments in parallel at all times. And many of these experiments are extremely short term. So maybe a week or two. I learned at a conference a couple weeks ago that on a platform of 1 billion users, you can just run an experiment for a day because you get enough data in one day to be able to make a decision about whether you should implement that feature or not. And that's a fairly common practice, which I found a little bit shocking, but I should stop being shocked. Shocked but not surprised, right? And the pattern that we see, in particular, around experimentation of features that are designed to improve integrity or safety, is that often at the beginning of the experiment, engagement will go down. And that's kind of what you would expect. If you're seeing less car crashes in your feed, then you have fewer car crashes that are hard to look away from. You might spend a few more minutes less per day on the platform. And so sometimes what happens here is that, product management sees the results after a week or two. They see that the engagement is dropping, and it's like, well, we got to cancel this experiment. This is not good, right? Whereas if the experiment were allowed to continue, then over time, we might get back to the point where, especially if we're surveying users about their satisfaction or their lack of regret, this kind of thing, that the user retention or satisfaction metrics overall might go back up. But many of these experiments are not even allowed to run for that long because of the short-term effects on engagement. So our core recommendation here is to institutionalize a practice across the industry of long-term holdout assessments, basically where we take a group of users, we hold them out of all algorithmic design changes on the platform for 12 months. And then at the end of the 12 months, we require the platforms to publicly disclose the metrics and the results of this assessment, comparing the holdout group to the general population. Again, there's an incentive built in here, right? So if those metrics are going to be about, long-term value, satisfaction, lack of regret, mental health, and so on, the platform is incentivized to have the metrics for the population group be better than the ones for the holdout group. That's all those great changes that they made over the course of 12 months should be reflected in a more satisfied user base who's receiving the changes than those who are not receiving the changes. This is pretty familiar for people who do research, but it's less, it's definitely not standardized or common across the industry. Lots of companies run holdout experiments. Some of them run long holdout experiments, but it's not a common practice that applies to all the design changes for an algorithmic system over the course of the 12 months. So our recommendations are to require that these assessments be conducted, to have those metrics be published, and to subject the whole design of these assessments to an independent audit, because otherwise, how would you be able to trust it? As we know, we've seen with other risk assessment frameworks and so on, you need some independent assessment. And there's a lot of trickiness about how to design these, make them representative for the population, and so on. So it requires independent oversight. So that's the third set of recommendations. I'll just say a few words about how this has been received from policymakers. So we published the report in March, kind of did broad-based public education about both the kind of tutorial part, like how recommender systems work, which I skipped for all of you because I didn't think you needed it, but also the policy guidance. Did sort of direct engagement. I did a webinar for 90 people at Ofcom about this, the UK online safety regulator. A lot of sort of one-to-one engagement with various policy audiences. We also did what we call a legislative toolkit for state, US state lawmakers that I'll talk about in a second. So we've done kind of like a broad base of different kinds of engagement with different policy audiences, just to get them accustomed to the concept and to talk about how it fits into their existing or potentially forthcoming regulatory regimes. In the European Union, we've had, I would say, really amazing traction. So the Digital Services Act, I think people are broadly familiar with it. Core construct of the Digital Services Act is that it's meant to mitigate what they call systemic risks. And there's a section of it, Article 28, which is specifically focused on the protection of minors and risks to their privacy and security and safety. And the way that this regulation works is the regulation was published, it came into effect in 2023, but then there's a lot more work that the European Commission does to provide additional guidance about how the provision should be interpreted, and in some cases, even extending the law to make more clear what companies need to do to comply. So in the case of online protection of minors, they issued some guidance over this summer. And I think based on engagement from us and actually a variety of other people, you can actually directly see some of the concepts from the Better Feeds work embedded in the guidance that the European Commission issued. So they talk about making sure that reliance on implicit engagement-based signals is only done after sort of having assessed what's in the best interest of the user. that implicit signals or they sort of give a definition of what implicit signals means, which I think is the first time I've ever seen this in any kind of policy document. And then they talk about prioritizing explicit user-provided signals, and again, sort of give their own definition of what that means, and get pretty detailed as far as that what that definition covers. So for us, this was pretty dramatic. We don't usually see a policymaking body that is, so convinced by this line of argument that they kind of take some of the concepts wholesale. Obviously, they didn't take everything from better feeds, but this I think is a really good start in terms of putting down the marker that at least in the space of minors online, they were convinced in terms of the line of argumentation and the need for this. And this is a concept and a set of concepts that will be exercised through the implementation of the DSA going forward. So they have enforcement actions, they have investigations against the companies that are covered by the regime, and we will continue to learn more about how the companies are interpreting these definitions, and where the boundary is in terms of what can be required. On the US front, we've focused on state legislators, as I said. So the first thing that we did was a legislative toolkit, which tried to take the notions from better feeds and turn it into legislative language that could be adopted in a variety of different legislative vehicles. And you can see a little snippet of that here when we have to actually write down concretely as a legislative definition what some of these things mean, which is not that straightforward to do. It's not, you can't just take the report and turn it into legislation. So so you see some definitions there, this concept of high value data that we had to create in order to make it workable in the context of legislation. We shared this with a wide variety of state legislators who are working on online child safety over the summer. And one of the common reactions that we got from them was, can't you just give us a model bill? We don't want these components that we could use in different legislative vehicles. Can you just give me a bill? I will give it to my legislative counsel. They will file it, and then we'll be off to the races, which I was surprised by. That was not the reaction I was necessarily expecting. So we're now working on that, likely to publish that in the next couple of weeks. But I suspect that something along these lines will be filed for introduction in 1 or 2 states, given the reaction that we've had thus far. And what's next? So we have a few follow-on pieces of work in the pipeline. One is what we're calling bringing better feeds to life. So we had a student join us over the summer who started looking into what we have been calling alternative social media networks, although they're not really alternative, but just kind of trying to see where in practice are some of these better feeds concepts already existing that we could potentially showcase or sort of use to prove out some of the value of the recommendations. So there are a bunch of these new services. Surf is like a social browser. It lets you customize feeds. There's actually quite a lot of services now that let you customize feeds. We've also dug in a little bit on where we're really seeing survey data used in the wild in order to tune people's feeds. So that's a piece that's going to try to summarize and showcase where we're seeing these concepts across services, some of which most people have never heard of, and others that are a little bit more in more common use. We've been doing a little bit more deep diving into long-term user value measurement, specifically how platforms are already trying to measure long-term user value, because some of them are, and supporting some industry work on that. We have a possible research collaboration in the pipeline that would work together with youth to co-design what does it mean to have a long-term value-oriented feed for youth. This is probably, I'll just head it off, the #1 question that I get when I give this talk is kids don't know what is in their long-term interest. How do you really figure it out? We have some language in the report about also referencing public health authorities. How would we bring information in from them in order to figure out how to design a long-term value-oriented feed for youth? But we potentially have an opportunity to do it as a co-design project with some other researchers at Stanford. And I'm super interested in people's other ideas for what's missing here. I know you got the short version of the talk, but what are the open questions that this raises in your mind? What would be interesting for future research or development of additional evidence to try to refine some of the arguments that we can make and bring back into the policy debate. And that, I think, is it on Better Feeds. And I should say I'm also happy to talk about like standards or net neutrality or whatever, any of the other things too, if people want to. So, or competition, antitrust. So, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Great talk. I'm of the opinion, I know other people are as well, that this is probably like the most important issue in tech policy. So it's really cool that you're working on it. I do have a couple questions / concerns. So it seems like sort of an assumption that's being made in these guidelines is that explicit preferences are like valuable for the way that we construct feeds. And while I would agree that they're probably a lot more valuable than implicit preferences that are trying to be inferred, explicit preferences are notoriously like hard for people to know themselves. They can also be manipulated if we did require that people use explicit preferences. There are ways that a platform could manipulate them to continue to drive engagement. And so I'm wondering, like, is really explicit preferences the way to approach a better feed? And a related note is I feel concerned about the overemphasis of the harms to minors, because while I agree that relative to adults the risks are greater, I think that the focus on minors sort of detracts from the fact that these are actually also really significant concerns for adult users, and that if we're willing to be complacent with legislation that says, oh, minors need to have these better feed signals, then this is sort of giving like a perverse incentive where the more like larger issue, which is encompassing both minors and adults, is being sort of neglected. So I would love to hear your thoughts on those.
Yeah, those are fantastic observations. I would say on explicit preferences, you reflect exactly the diversity of opinions that we had in our group, if you remember this, Arvind, like, which is why ultimately there were people who wanted that definition of long-term user value to really only be about explicit user preferences, and then there was a lot of argument the other way saying like it needs to be broader because of all of the reasons that you give, and that's, I think, why we have that more fulsome notion of thinking about survey, thinking about other kinds of signals that people give, right, and not like being solely reliant on whatever is given explicitly. I think in the translation to the actual sort of legislative language, although that's not in our model language, it's still a broader concept, but in the DSA guidelines, it got sort of boiled down. It's hard because some of these other concepts are like a little bit more slippery, and if you try to enumerate them, then you're inventing a lot that's new. But I definitely agree with you. I think that concern is real, and like keeping it live for the policy conversation is very important. On the minors versus adults, in our group, I think everyone who was participating, like there was no one who was really focused on kids in the group, and a lot of people were actually there because they're they're interested more in the political science aspects and polarization, extremism, and so forth. So I think it's a little bit of we have to use the wedge that we have, right? And that's where the policy conversation is, and so we need to be able to talk to those people to figure out how this work translates for the actual need that they're addressing today. But when we talk about it, we always give it the broader sweep. And I do think there's other people who think about that too. So like I talked to a staffer in the Massachusetts legislature who his boss has one of these like addictive feeds bills, which is partially what this is reacting to because it has that false binary embedded in it. She's running that this year. He said, we want to do something for adults. Next year, we'll come back to you. So we always try to keep that conversation live because I agree with you. It's sort of like the topic du jour. we need to meet people where they are, but we're trying to open their aperture so that they think about it for adults as well.
Thank you. Really fascinating topic. I think I have a somewhat related question actually. And I was glad to see you mention sort of this measurement of long-term value as a next step, but I'm curious if you think about it more as like an individualistic long-term value where people like know exactly what is good for them once you hit 18, I guess, and therefore can like, again, drive these systems toward work in your best interest over long term, or whether you think it's more of like a collectivist or for the common good goal that everybody should eventually approach. And also in that case, do you then get into territory where the tech becomes a little paternalistic and it's like, okay, well, you're saying you want to eat potato chips, but I actually know you shouldn't. And so stop watching this video about car crashes right now.
Yeah. So I think on the first question, I think this was conceived of in keeping in mind the way that platforms already instrument this, which is essentially by collecting data from individuals and then trying to optimize for that individual. So in that frame, I think it's hard to figure out how you would do it societally from the platform's perspective. Although I think this is a cool idea to think about, but we didn't really think about it that way. I would also say though, it's not like, for a 14-year-old, long-term isn't necessarily when you're 18. It's literally just like when you stop and think, when you put your app down, like how do you want to feel, right? Do you want to feel uplifted? Do you want to feel like you saw something funny? This sort of like more around the satisfaction kind of metrics versus a particular defined point in the future. So that's hopefully gives a little bit of a sense of it. Yeah.
So one of the things I really liked about this is replacing one kind of dominant metric with a better dominant metric. But then I have a question about, even if you could measure value somehow, the long-term part of it seems really hard. So it seems like if you change something and then you have to wait 12 months to see if that change was effective, the changing pace of the system seems to exceed the pace of the evaluation if you have this long-term metric. So I'm wondering how you think about the difference in timescales.
You mean that the platform gets feedback like more quickly for every change that they make?
Like you said, they
Sure.
can do an experiment in a day. If they have to wait a year to see if a new feature works, that means many fewer iterations.
I see. Yeah, I don't think our expectation would be that they would wait a year. I mean, that's sort of the idea of the holdout is that you just take this small subset of users, you hold them out of all the design changes, and everybody else is getting whatever changes the platform thinks are best. But then it's an accountability mechanism at the end of the year to say, like, was the accumulation of all of those changes actually better than no changes at all? That's kind of the idea.
There's kind of a follow-up on this, which is that like the short-term metrics are really useful for internal management purposes. So I wonder like how that's come up in some of your conversations with platforms, if you get a lot of like, that would be great, but I need to hold people to account quarter on quarter, and so like I can't use that.
I haven't gotten that response, but if you're assessing long-term metrics consistently, that's not a problem, right? So if at any given juncture you say like, how are our long-term metrics looking over the past 12 months? Like you can do that every quarter. It's just shifting what they're focusing on in terms of what they use to rate people's performance.
Yeah, so I mean, you don't have the link to the thing the manager did that quarter.
Correct, but again, I worked in the industry on standardization projects that took 3 years. Like you find a way to judge people based on whatever the intermediate metric is, right? Like, I don't think this is a requirement in order to have like a functioning company, I guess. Yes.
Do you feel like you get a lot of pushback from these platform providers when you talk about some of the ideas that you're proposing here? It seems like for policymakers, you seem to be getting like some positive feedback, at least from the EU, as you mentioned, and from the state legislators here in the US. But I was wondering if sort of when you actually talk to sort of the platform providers if they feel like, yeah, this sounds all well and good, but we're not gonna keep doing this unless it's a law and we're
Right.
enforceable and we need to do this. Do you feel like there's a bit of like, I don't wanna say goodwill, but like the company's realizing that something needs to change here and they're trying to sort of implement some of these sort of recommendations you have maybe a bit ahead of time before the law actually kicks in?
Yeah, so I think this is broadly representative of, I think, how most civil society engagement goes with the largest platforms these days, which is, it really depends who you're talking to and which team, right? So I meet somebody from the policy team at these companies, like, yeah, this is like a total non-starter, especially the transparency piece. Like, transparency is just like verboten, right? And there's, in the US, mounting legal precedent in their favor that they don't have to disclose anything. So that's one kind of interaction. But as I said, we had people from industry participate in this group for this last piece on bringing the better feeds to life and looking at alternative systems. We talked to people from a variety of quite large companies who are like in the data science team or on the integrity team, or it's their job. Our author from Pinterest, like his job is long-term value at Pinterest. So he is forging and he's like on an internal crusade to get people behind some of these ideas. And those kinds of people are happy to engage with this. They don't agree with everything, but see the value to them internally for a case that they're trying to make. So there's not like a monolithic corporate response. I think, if it was like in the press or on Capitol Hill, there would be a monolithic response, but when we talk to people day to day, it's much more varied.
You brought up the dichotomy for like no algorithm versus having like these personalized algorithms. I was wondering if you thought a little bit on the side of the user, like you have this competing dichotomy between people that are having salad diet and people with no salad diet. I was wondering if you thought about the fact that I think a lot of users might engage with some kind of in between, like you can have salad most of the time, but if you're at a party, you can have potato chips.
Yes.
Whether that had been at all, or it was too much in the minutia for your work.
No, I mean, I think that's ideally what you would end up with, right? If this is part of the notion of like getting the user to define what's in their interest,
I just
because
feel like the user is not going to define if the choice is salad or no salad, salad or potato chips all the time, or salad all the time.
right, but I don't think that needs to be the choice, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Even when you're incorporating more input from the user, like I would guess, this is complete speculation, that the serendipity of the For You feed is something that people really like. You encounter things that you never encountered before, right? And that's great. And maybe there's a way to maintain some of that without it leading you down a rabbit hole of suicidality because of one thing that you searched on, right? So like, I guess, I think the motivation for this was a sort of refusal to believe that those are the only choices.
Yeah.
Is there another question here?
We have time for one last question.
Okay.
So there's a way in which the three chunks of the recommendations that you described, the transparency, the user choices, and the assessment, are doing three different things. And so I wanted to sort of press you on why the user choices are important, given that you said users don't use them. It seems like the first and the third part recommendations are really about forcing or asking platforms to generate useful forms of knowledge and information about what they're actually doing and studying them systematically. The user choices, as you acknowledge, are sort of a veneer of like optionality on a system that is engineered to circumvent them. So why bother with user choice?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of the policies that have been proposed are oriented around user choice. Even the ones for minors, it's like making this the default and then letting them opt out, or having their parents opt them in or out. There's like optionality as the baseline for a lot of the policy proposals, and then certainly the DSA, where it's explicit that they have to provide this one other choice, non-profiling feed. So I think what we wanted to do was provide a more thoughtful alternative it's like, if we know that choice and agency is like the place that a lot of policymakers start, then like, let's show them how that, there's a better version of that than the thing that they're contemplating, even if we also want to redirect their attention to the more important pieces of this, of which I agree with you. I think the long-term assessment piece is the most important piece. So it was sort of like, it feels like it's kind of table stakes because every one of these proposals has some choice, some provision in it. So let's just show you like how you could do it better. Thanks.